Yes. Yes, you.
Yeah, I'm really curious, since you raised the Pandora's box about, you're saying that it's an illegitimate question to start out saying, first acknowledge our existence. We're here, we exist, please, acknowledge our existence. That's somehow a deal breaker to even negotiate or discuss anything. So, I think that's really a really troubling blockage. And so what that segues into is my curious concern about, since you're a big fan of Gulen, as I am, and he's about peace and dialogue and reconciliation, okay, but the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't disavow jihad's violent means for purification of faith reasons, and the right to kill an unbeliever, in the service of the civil society that they envisage. So is there any reconciliation that you see in light of your notion, I'm curious that they formed a political party that you think Gulen's people support, and at the same time, you're starting off from a launching pad where you're saying we refuse, essentially, to acknowledge the existence of Israel. Do you see that there's any reconciliation possible in that scenario, or do you find that that's, I'm frankly sort of shocked. So help me here.
We're very close to the end, so what I'm going to suggest is that we see how many more questions there are. I know, Joseph, you have one. How many other questions? Let's put about 3 or 4 more questions and then give each person a minute or two. So, Joseph Peters over there.
Yes, thank
Otherwise,
you.
we could get into this one for...
Thank you very much. I'm from the World Bank. I was just wondering, in just observing what has been happening so far, is the very nature of educating not actually changing? Because when I listen to the issue of unevenness of power being the crux of a lot of the conflict, and education being one of the possible proactive ways of addressing this. If we really observe what's been happening, we are seeing that education, as we know it, the internet has actually changed everything. Education is less formal now. Access to information, access to education seem to be what is moving the youth, whereby the issue even of corruption, transparency is more obvious. So we're having a more leveling field whereby you cannot hoard information or knowledge and use it as power, but it becomes more transparent. And I'm looking at a situation where if we're having greater equality in terms of education, and I think ICT plays a big role here, then the CSOs, the civil society, NGOs, will be having information that is nearly about the same as the government or people in power. And that, to me, is a big paradigm shift. I just want to comment on this.
Can you give it to her? How many other burning questions, just so I know? Okay. So one more, you and one more, and then we pass the mic.
Thanks. Good morning. My name is Allison Johnson. I'm an international political economist. And I wanted to dive into something that Stanley was bringing up around institutions and how the example of the USA and this institution and these 3 branches create a whole different dynamic in our society. And to see if Bilal and Mohammed can touch on the institutions that are being built in the Iraq example and some of the examples you've seen in Egypt as it's moving forward. Because I would like to see if we could discuss a little bit about the other folks in the region that are going to be influencing the building of institutions and the democratic structures that are going to exist in these newly emerging democracies. Number one, the influence of Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabi movement and its influence on the education across the region. What other impacts Iran may have in the building of institutions across the region, and how that contrasts with perhaps some of the Western civilization institutions that may be pushing in that democratization process. And finally, if it's possible, Stanley, to just touch a little bit as you push on this issue of the rule of law, the importance of our judicial branch, the extent to which that kind of institutionalization can be imposed from the outside. In other words, the USAID, the Department of Justice, they have lots of programs to, again, bring that institution into the rest of the world. Is that possible, or is that something that has to be from the grassroots, from the bottom up, to want to have institutions based on similar rules of law that we've built in Western civilization? Thank you.
The last question at the back, and then you each get a minute, I think.
Hi. Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about sort of crisis in American education. And there's also been a lot of really bad mistakes that Americans are making in terms of Islam. Book burnings, burning the Quran, voting against Sharia law without really knowing what it is. George Bush didn't know that there was a difference between Shia and Sunni. So we're teaching people to do business and technology and medicine and all these other things, but no one wants to fund history, philosophy. Americans are very bad at geography. So, who needs the humanities? They're not money makers. Let's get rid of them. But it turns out that without study in the humanities, we have a completely distorted view of the Islamic world. And so public opinion formation about our MENA policy is distorted by this. It seems very dangerous. And I wonder if anyone's looking into and trying to frame a solution to this crisis in American education, where it's not just run on a business model, but for business purposes, at the expense of an informed public that knows anything about the Middle East.
Let's start there. All right. I'm going to comment on the issue of transparency as one solution, one of the solutions to corruption. Yes, indeed, empowering the public is one of the most important counterbalances to powers of corruption. However, we're talking about a people that once they know, they can act on it. Transparency assumes that corruption happens because people don't know, and then if we let people know about what their officials are doing, that they're going to do something about it. But in some of the examples that I talked about, if the dependency is that heavy, knowledge is not going to change much. Knowledge would not lead to action, would not empower. Naming and shaming may still remain, but I've heard Iraqi officials say that the media has the freedom to speak and we have the freedom not to listen. It's a challenge. Therefore, relying on only one tool is not going to be enough. And in terms of institution, to just very briefly address it, yes, in the case of Iraq, there are the right institutions in place in the appearance. But just in the way that the American history has had power struggles between the three branches of the government, in which, at times the executive, well, increasingly the executive has been gaining and wielding more power versus the two others, a pattern is emerging in Iraq as well, in which a lot of the independent commissions, like the Commission on Public Integrity, which fights corruption, the Election Commission, and right now the commission that is supposed to be independent, bound to the parliament and fund the NGOs, have all been taken under the arms of the government, which takes me back to my presentation, in which actually there is a clause in the non-governmental and civil society funding law that the Kurdish government passed that says that the government will fund organizations based on their projects and will then hold them accountable on how the money has been spent. I think this panel was about how the NGOs and CSOs can hold the government accountable. But I'm telling you about a law that requires the government to hold the CSOs accountable. So institutions can go only that far.
On the rule of law, when the Cold War was ending, I was really amazed to see these articles in the Soviet press on the rule of law state. Gorbachev described perestroika as a legal revolution. And he said it was based on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, And this is what I was seeing in I don't know the Gorbachev stuff, but I saw this in the Soviet literature. And the book that came up all the time was Kant's essay on the rule of law state. And one thing in particular affected the Russians during that time, and this is the legislative control over the war power. I began to see articles on that. First of all, human rights. They began to say that they had been wrong on the issue of human rights, that no country could say that its domestic situation was immune from international human rights standards. I found this extraordinary at the end of the Cold War. They were openly admitting we were wrong. Those days are gone, by the way. I don't see that anymore. And similarly on the war powers. I remember seeing an article in Kommunist, the leading journal of the Soviet Communist Party, which was arguing that Russia had nothing to, the Soviet Union then, had nothing to fear from countries that had legislative control over the war power, because as the Vietnam War demonstrated, once a war got to a certain level, the legislature would intervene and put a stop to it. And any war against the Soviet Union would be so big. And then you saw these questions about how did we get into Afghanistan without the Supreme Soviet, just a few people starting it. And when Gorbachev was sworn in as president of the Soviet Union, he said from this point onward, the president cannot on his own authority send the armed forces outside the country, to attack another country. It would be under the legislative control. Those days are now gone. I find this a great tragedy. The one hope I have here, and this is one of the reasons I made the reference to the students now studying other things. I am amazed the last few years how many Chinese students I meet studying law coming over here. I don't think this has received enough attention. Why are they studying law? To come over here and study, Every year I go to reception at the State Department for the Washington Foreign Law Society. It's a nice reception. I invariably meet at least one Chinese law student. And just, in meetings around town. So that, I think, is an interesting observation about where China may be heading.
Okay, well, very quickly on the role of new institutions. I think some institutions, a lot of institutions exist there, especially like in the case of Egypt. They just need to work right. I'll tell you, I met with the director of the elite Egyptian think tank, the Ahram Center for Strategic and Political Studies, 2 months before January 25th, where he told me that, if the National Democratic Party would run, and they were about to run for election, that was the rigged election, they're going to get a majority for sure, and of course they did. But they got a majority. I said, well, even if they're not under the tutelage of the state, he said, yeah, they would get overwhelming majority on their own. Now this guy, after the same person, is a nice person, accomplished intellectual and writer and researcher. After the revolution, he turned into a pro-democracy analyst, and so. The institutions and the intellect is there. They just need to work right, and without oppression, without dictatorship, they can work right. Some institutions need new institutions need to be established, and the Golan movement experience is instructive. Those intercultural programs, Arab groups, and again, because of oppression, they were not able to communicate with each other. They were not able to do cultural programs where Copt and Muslim can meet. And so now this is happening after the departure of Mubarak, and a lot still needs to happen. But I'm sure people will find a way. On the Muslim Brotherhood and Israel, I didn't even talk about existence and issuing any conditions on dialogue about recognizing anybody's existence. I was just addressing the issue of that education on pluralism and acceptance of the other needs to encompass everybody, including the Israelis. That's all I was talking about.
Well, thank you all to the panel and to all of you who raised such interesting questions. Clearly, this is a discussion that's just begun. So thank the panel and move on to the next step.